Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and I'm doing a brief lecture today on map, reduce and filter, which are general programming concepts, but we're going to explore them in the context of JavaScript. It's going to be a very short lecture. Now, map, reduce and filter are basically three member functions of list types in JavaScript that allow us to manipulate lists in different ways. The first one is map. And what map allows us to do is basically take a list of n elements and turn it into another list of n elements with some kind of transformation. So it's a little bit like a transform function. Then we have reduce, and reduce is where you take a list and you essentially, via some kind of functional rule or reducer, take that list of n items and reduce it to a single value. And then we have filter, which is where we don't modify any of the values. We take a list of n items and we produce a list that has 0 to n items in it, with those items unmodified. So it's essentially it's literally like that, it's a filter. It's a selecting of certain types. We're going to go through a more detailed example, but just to kind of quickly go through them, it's like, for something like a map here, you might have a number 1, 2, 3, a list with 1, 2, 3, and if you map each item with some kind of function, it applies this function to every item in this and produces a new list. So for instance, if I just, we come back to this file, if I just here run node on numbers.js, I know what's happening here, one sec. Sorry, it was just a bad variable. So basically what happens is you take a list of items and you apply a transformation to every element in it via this function. So when you do .map, you're saying, okay, go and take every element and call the function make square on it and return the result. Now map, reduce, map and filter in particular, they produce copies of lists. So they're not doing an in-place transformation, they're actually making copies of the list. So you can see that's map. I'll jump to filter first. Filter's quite similar in how easy it is. Filter is like you have a list of items and you filter it based on this rule, and what this rule is a function, and every item that you're filtering, that item gets passed into that function, and if the function returns true, it includes it in the produced list, and if the function returns false, it does not include it in the produced list. So in this case, this one filters for only even numbers, like that. And then the last type we have is a reduce function. And a reduce function, the way to think of a reduce function is it's like a function that has a running total and it has a new input. And what it's constantly doing is grabbing something from a list, pulling it in, combining it into that total, which is getting bigger, grabbing another item, combining it into that total, which is getting bigger, and then bigger, like that. So in this case, we have a list of items and we call a reduce on it, where we say that we're going to start with a total of 0, and every single item in my list I'm going to call getSum on it, which will essentially sum them up over time. Reducers aren't really that common because typically you would just use a sum function here. Like, you don't really need a reduction for things like this, like for basic things like multiplication and averages and sums. They're kind of easy to do in JavaScript and most other scripting languages, so it's more often that you're going to do this for some kind of quite custom sum or reduction. So in this case, we can sum them up like that. Now, a more interesting example just to go through is actually the exercises 2 question from one of your labs, which is this one here, where we basically have a list of numbers and then we have a bunch of outputs that we want. So we want to know the sum of the numbers, we want to know the positive sum, as in the sum of all the positive numbers, the sum of all the even numbers, the sum of all the numbers above 400, and the sum of the numbers between indexes 20 and 40 exclusively. So that's as in the array indexes. Now, this is the solution we provided, where we basically get all the numbers through some fairly straightforward logic. This is the kind of logic that you would do as a first year. But I want to show you how you can solve this problem in a more concise way using map, reduce and filter. And it's actually pretty straightforward. So the first thing we can do is this sum here. Instead of setting these as 0 and then populating it, let's actually let's actually use different functions. So we know that for summing, we can use a reduce function. So I can say numbers.reduce, and then I give it a reducer and a starting value, which we've seen before. So in this case, the reducer might be some numbers, and the starting value might be 0. So then we define our own sum numbers function, which will take in a total and a value. And what it's going to do is it's going to return me total plus value. Now, because this function is so simple, I can actually get rid of these braces and return value, and I can shorten it just like this. And I can say, okay, well, sum numbers is a function that takes in these arguments and it returns this value. And because this is even shorter, I could put it in like this. And I could, really shorten this down. This would be a fairly standard programming pattern where you're just like, this is kind of a way of saying sum. So that's how you'd sum those numbers. That's pretty straightforward. The next question is, how do you do a positive sum? Okay, well, let me just get rid of all these first and we can see how we go. So we start off with sum. Now, if I open up this, okay, we got our sum, 40244. Well, firstly, how do we get the positive numbers? Right, so I'll say positive numbers equals numbers, and then I'll filter it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter it whether or not it's odd or even. So I'll say is even the function. And then I'll go and define that. I'll say const is even equals a function that takes in a number. And if the number is even, then it returns true, else it returns false. Now you could simplify this function even further by just saying return that, right? Because it's a bit redundant, the logic we had. But then again, because this is a single return line function, we could actually shorten it even further and just say that. And then because we only want to use this once here, we could shorten this even further if we wanted to and say that, our numbers filter is actually just going to get given a function with a number input that returns number mod 2 is equal to 0. Basically returns if it's even. So there's our positive numbers. Now how do we do a sum? Well, we've done this before. We basically take a list and we do the reduction on it, except in this case the list is going to be the positive numbers. Oops, I did this for even. This should be even, my bad. I meant to say even numbers, like this. Even numbers. Right, so that's how we get the even numbers. The positive ones are also easy, right? Because we could do the exact same thing where we actually say, well, the positive numbers are just going to be the numbers filtered by I'm only interested in the numbers that are greater than 0. Right, so you can see how you can actually, once you get familiar with these patterns, you can write very concise code. And then the positive sum is just going to be positive numbers with that reduction formula that we're used to, which is just the value plus the running total. Okay, slowly getting there. Now we need the sum of all numbers above 400. Okay, well, similar thing here. We could say that const, num above 400 equals numbers.filter, but we're only interested in the numbers that are greater than 400. Easy. Num over 400 dot reduce tb t plus v, and then the sum of all array items with index between 20 and 40. Now this one's a little bit harder, but before we do that, let's actually just make sure we have this working and that we haven't made a mistake. Oop, I've got a syntax error. So what's my syntax error? Positive numbers is not a function. Oops, yeah, that should be reduce. Cool, okay, that works. Now how do we do all these indexes? This one's a little bit harder, but we can actually do it pretty easily because when you do a filter, right? Like if I say const numbers 20 to 40, numbers index 20 to 40. When I say numbers.filter, if we call a filter function, I'll just call it my function, right? And my function will just take in a number and it will return true, right? So this filter will do nothing because it will return everything. But I'll also console log the number. So let's see what this one does. And it should console log every single number here, right? Because this my function is going to get called on every number because that's how filters work. Filters are applied to the list once and they iterate through the list and they apply your filter function to every item to see if you should include it in the new list. Okay, so there's all my numbers. The thing about filter though is filter can actually take in 2 parameters if you want to. One of them's hidden, and it's actually the index. So now you can see that if I do this, I actually get the value and the index. So if I want to, I can have a filter function that takes in that second parameter, and then I can filter via a different method. I could say, you know, if index is greater or equal to 20 and index is less or equal to 40, then return true, else return false. But again, this is just simple logic that I could keep reducing down until it's a one-line function. Really, really easy, like that. I'd probably write this one in brackets just for cleanliness. And voila, there's our filter for all numbers in that space. So there. And then we could do the same thing here. Numbers indexed to 40, dot reduce, tv, t plus v0. I might have gotten something wrong there besides the syntax error, but you get the point. This is the kind of approach, and you can see it's pretty clean here. In fact, you know, if we just wanted to get different lists, we could do this in 4 lines with not much code. So definitely a worthwhile programming pattern to get familiar with. Obviously, it's going to make your code easier to read for other people, but it's also probably going to help you write code faster and with less bugs, because the less code you write, less bugs you have. So hope that gives you a bit of an insight into MapReduce and filter. Thanks, everyone.